the earliest memories etched into my mind are laced with an odd blend of nostalgia and unease. My great-grandparents' house was an imposing structure, its age betrayed by the creak of its wooden floors and the whisper of its drafty corridors. It sat at the end of a long gravel road, surrounded by gnarled trees whose branches seemed to claw at the sky. The house itself had a life to it, a quiet, almost brooding presence that clung to its aging walls. The paint was faded, peeling in long strips, and the windows, slightly clouded with time, always seemed to catch the light in a way that made them appear alive, as if they were watching. After my great-grandfather passed away, my visits to the house became more frequent. My great-grandmother lived there alone, and though she seemed perfectly comfortable in her solitude, the stillness of the house unsettled me even at that young age. I was only 4 or 5, barely old enough to comprehend loss, let alone the mysteries that lurked in the corners of her home. She would often sit in her rocking chair by the fireplace, her frail frame draped in a thick, worn shawl. She was the picture of calm, stoic, kind, and reassuring, but there was always something in her eyes that hinted at an understanding far beyond what she ever put into words. The nights in that house were the most vivid. I remember lying in the small, spare room she had prepared for me, tucked under a heavy quilt that smelled faintly of lavender and old wood. The air always seemed colder at night, as though the house itself exhaled a frosty breath once the sun dipped below the horizon. It was in those hours that the strangeness began. The knocks were the first to come, sharp, deliberate taps that echoed through the stillness. They never followed a rhythm, and they never came from the same place twice. Sometimes they were at the front door, sometimes along the walls, and other times they seemed to emanate from within the very bones of the house itself. Footsteps often followed. They were soft at first, like someone tiptoeing cautiously, but soon they would grow bolder, heavier, as if whoever, or whatever, was walking had gained confidence. I would press my face into my pillow, clutching the quilt up to my chin, my tiny heart hammering in my chest. Even then, I could sense that these sounds were not the normal creaks of an old house settling into its foundation. There was an intention behind them, a purpose I couldn't understand but instinctively feared. And then there were the whispers. They came so faintly at first that I wasn't sure if I was imagining them. But as the nights wore on, they became unmistakable. Low, murmuring voices would slip through the cracks in the silence, just barely loud enough to register. They were incomprehensible, like a conversation in a language I had never heard, and yet they carried an undeniable weight, as though their words were meant for me, even if I couldn't understand them. The kitchen was another source of unease. Pots and pans would clang together in the middle of the night, the sound ringing out as if someone were rifling through them with urgency. My great-grandmother never seemed disturbed by these occurrences. In fact, she would smile when I timidly mentioned the noises. "That's just your great-grandpa," she'd say with a chuckle, her voice warm but firm. She would even speak to him on occasion, addressing the unseen presence in a jestful tone as though he were still alive and merely playing tricks. Now, you behave yourself," she'd say, wagging a finger at the empty air. I watched her, wide-eyed, trying to make sense of what she was doing, but her calmness only deepened my confusion. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to think that the noises were just the harmless antics of a playful spirit, someone who loved us and meant no harm. But I couldn't shake the unease that coiled in my stomach every time the house came alive at night. The laughter in her voice as she spoke to him didn't match the heaviness that hung in the air, nor did it align with the cold shiver that ran down my spine whenever I was alone. Her passing, when it came, was sudden. One moment she was there, smiling in her rocking chair, humming an old hymn as she crocheted. The next, she was gone, leaving the house even quieter than before. I remember sitting on the front steps of the house after the funeral, staring at the gravel driveway that stretched out like a path to nowhere. The air felt different, heavier, darker. It was as though the house had absorbed her absence, pulling it deep into its core and letting it fester there. I didn't have the words for it then, but I could feel it. Her death had changed something fundamental about the place. And yet, the house didn't become still. If anything, the strange occurrences seemed to grow more pronounced in the weeks that followed. The knocks became louder, more insistent. The footsteps, once hesitant, now stomped with a kind of determination. The whispers grew bolder, their unintelligible words laced with something that felt almost like anger. I began to feel as though I were being watched, even in the daylight hours. The shadows in the corners seemed darker, more oppressive, and the once familiar rooms of the house felt foreign and unwelcoming. It was as if the house, now bereft of its last living guardian, had been left exposed to something it had been holding back for years. I couldn't explain it, but I could feel it. The presence that lingered in that house was no longer benign. If it had ever been my great-grandfather, as my great-grandmother claimed, he was gone now, and whatever had taken his place was far less forgiving. Looking back, I wonder if my great-grandmother's calmness had been a kind of shield, a forcible that kept the house's true nature at bay. Without her, there was nothing left to keep the darkness contained. At the time, I didn't know any of this. I was just a child, grappling with grief and fear in equal measure. But deep down, I think I always knew that the house was alive in a way it shouldn't have been, and that it had been waiting for something, or someone, all along. When we moved into the house after my great-grandmother's death, it was supposed to be a fresh start for my family. We'd fallen on hard times, and the house, sitting empty and waiting, was an opportunity we couldn't pass up. My mother, her third husband, my twin siblings, and I settled in quickly, but I could feel an uneasiness settle over me like a second skin. I didn't know then how deeply rooted that feeling was or how far it would go. I was only 8 years old, still in the 3rd grade, but I had a sense of the house's peculiarities, an instinct sharpened by my earliest memories of staying there with my great-grandmother. Now, without her calming presence, the house felt untethered, as though it had shed its thin veil of normalcy to reveal something raw and dangerous beneath. The house, built in the 1930s, was modest and weathered. Its 2 original bedrooms were cramped, with low ceilings and small windows that barely let in enough light to pierce the gloom. My mother and her husband claimed the living room as their sleeping space, their hideaway bed unfolding directly in front of my bedroom door. My siblings, still just infants, shared the 2nd bedroom, their cribs crammed into the small space. I had my own room, the one I had stayed in as a child during my visits. It hadn't changed much since then, though now the shadows seemed darker, the air heavier. The chifforobe closet still stood against the wall, towering and imposing like an ancient sentinel, its wooden doors warped slightly over the years. My bed, with its cold metal frame, sat at an odd angle near the window that faced the front yard. From the very first week we moved in, the house began to assert its presence. It started with noises, small, almost imperceptible sounds at first. The kind you could dismiss as the creaks and groans of an old house settling into the earth. But these sounds were different. They carried an intent, a kind of cadence that didn't match the randomness of natural noise. At night, as I lay in bed, I would hear faint footsteps shuffling in the living room. They were hesitant at first, like someone unsure of where they were going, but they grew bolder with each passing night. I would hold my breath and watch the faint glow of moonlight spill into the living room through the half-closed door. Sometimes, I would catch the movement of a shadow, a dark shape gliding just beyond the edge of the light. It wasn't the shadow of my mother or her husband, their sleeping forms were clearly visible on the fold-out couch. This shadow moved with purpose, too fluid and deliberate to be a trick of the eye. I would pull the blanket over my head, squeezing my eyes shut and praying for sleep to take me before the shadow could find its way into my room. But sleep was no sanctuary, as I began to wake at odd hours, jolted from restless dreams by the unmistakable sound of whispering. The voices were faint, their words impossible to make out, but they were there, an insistent, murmuring presence just beyond the threshold of understanding. They would rise and fall, sometimes accompanied by faint tapping sounds that seemed to echo from the walls themselves. I would sit frozen in bed, my small hands clutching the blankets tightly, afraid to move or make a sound. The chifforobe closet became the focal point of my unease. During the day, it stood silent and unassuming, its faded wood blending into the room's drab walls. But at night, it took on a life of its own. The noises began subtly, soft creaks and groans, as though the wood were shifting under some unseen strain. Then came the tapping, light at first but growing more insistent, like knuckles rapping against the inside of the closet doors. I would stare at it in the dim light, my eyes playing tricks on me as I imagined the warped wood bulging outward, as though something inside were trying to push its way out. One night, I worked up the courage to investigate. I crept out of bed on trembling legs, my bare feet cold against the wooden floor. With each step toward the chifforobe, the air seemed to grow heavier, pressing down on my small frame. My hand shook as I reached for the handle, and for a moment, I hesitated, a primal instinct screaming at me to turn back. But curiosity, or perhaps something darker, pushed me forward. I yanked the door open, half expecting to see a grotesque figure waiting for me inside. Instead, there was nothing but a hollow darkness that seemed to stretch deeper than the closet should have allowed. The faint smell of mothballs mixed with something faintly metallic wafted out, and I slammed the door shut, retreating to my bed with my heart pounding in my chest. The next morning, I hesitated before telling my mother about the noises and the shadowy figure. I was afraid she might dismiss me outright, chalking it up to childish fears or overactive imagination, but the experiences had felt so real, so vivid, that I couldn't keep them bottled up. As I finally worked up the courage to explain what had happened, she listened quietly, her face a carefully controlled mask. When I described the shadow moving in the living room and the way it seemed to have intent, her expression wavered ever so slightly. She brushed it off in the end, telling me it was probably just my imagination, a symptom of adjusting to a new home and dealing with the lingering sadness of losing my great-grandmother. But her words didn't match her tone, and her dismissive explanation didn't erase the flicker of unease I saw in her eyes as she turned away. I could tell she didn't entirely believe what she was saying, that there was a part of her that recognized my fear as something legitimate. She was trying to protect me, I realized, trying to shield me from a reality she wasn't ready to face herself. Perhaps she thought that ignoring the strange happenings in the house would make them go away, that denying their existence could somehow strip them of their power. But I could see through her attempt to appear composed. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the sleeves of her sweater, and her voice, though calm on the surface, carried an edge of tension. In that moment, I felt a strange mix of emotions, frustration that she wouldn't fully acknowledge my fears, and sadness that she seemed to be wrestling with her own inner turmoil. Her reassurances did little to comfort me, especially since I could tell she was trying just as hard to convince herself as she was to convince me. The truth lingered unspoken between us, a heavy, suffocating presence that neither of us dared to confront directly. It was as if we both understood, deep down, that something was wrong with the house, something beyond our comprehension. And yet, we were trapped, by circumstances, by grief, and by the growing sense of dread that hung over us like a storm cloud waiting to break. The activity in the house escalated in subtle but terrifying ways. The lights in my room began to flicker at random intervals, casting erratic shadows that seemed to dance across the walls. The tapping sounds grew louder, spreading from the chifforobe to the windows and even the floor beneath my bed. On some nights, I would feel the faintest vibration running through the metal bed frame, as though something unseen were testing its strength. I started sleeping with a flashlight clutched in my hand, though its weak beam did little to dispel the darkness. One night, I woke to the sound of scratching at my bedroom window. It was a soft, deliberate sound, like fingernails dragging across the glass. My heart thundered as I turned to look, half expecting to see a face staring back at me from the darkness outside. But the window was empty, the yard beyond shrouded in shadows. The scratching continued, relentless and mocking, until I finally mustered the courage to yank the curtains closed. The sound stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. The culmination of my terror came a few weeks later. I woke in the middle of the night to the unmistakable sensation of my bed shaking. At first, it was gentle, almost imperceptible, but it quickly grew more violent, the metal frame rattling against the floor with a rhythmic intensity. I clung to the mattress, my breath caught in my throat as I tried to make sense of what was happening. The room seemed to hum with energy, a low, droning sound that vibrated in my chest. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the shaking stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. When the first rays of sunlight crept through the window, I felt a fleeting sense of relief, as though the house's grip on me had loosened in the light of day. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. Whatever lived in that house had only begun to make itself known, and I was powerless to stop it. It was watching, waiting, and I could feel its presence growing stronger with each passing night. The night I woke to the bright lights flooding my room, I thought for sure there was some logical explanation. Maybe a car had pulled into the yard, headlights beaming straight through the window. But as I blinked myself awake and turned to look, I realized how impossible that was. The window faced the front yard, but there was nothing there, no car, no people, no source for the blinding light. Yet it poured into the room with an intensity that made my eyes ache. The light wasn't steady either. It pulsed, flickering faintly, as though some unseen force was breathing life into it. I sat frozen in my bed, trying to convince myself that I was dreaming, but every detail was too sharp, too vivid to be anything other than real. Then, just as suddenly as the light had appeared, it vanished, plunging the room into a suffocating darkness. It was as if the house had absorbed it, drawing it deep into its walls like a sponge soaking up water. For a moment, I thought I could hear something, a faint, rhythmic sound, almost like a heartbeat. I held my breath and listened, but it faded away too quickly to be sure. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, clutching my knees to my chest and staring at the window, half expecting the light to return. But it didn't. The following nights weren't much better. I began to notice the strange lights more often, though they never seemed as blinding as the first time. They would appear faintly at first, just a glow creeping along the edges of my window, then brighten until my entire room was bathed in their eerie radiance. On one particularly unsettling night, I woke to see the light in the living room, spilling out like molten gold through the cracks around my bedroom door. I could hear faint noises, like someone moving around, slow, deliberate footsteps and the occasional scrape of furniture being shifted. I wanted to scream for my mother, but I was too scared to make a sound. I couldn't shake the feeling that the lights were trying to lead me somewhere, but to what, I didn't know. And then there was the figure. I saw it for the first time about a week after the lights began appearing. I had woken up in the middle of the night again, the oppressive silence pressing down on me like a physical weight. I turned over in bed, and that's when I saw it. The figure was standing in the living room, just beyond the threshold of my door. Unlike the shadows that had haunted me before, this one was bathed in light, a glowing, ethereal presence that seemed almost too perfect, too clean. Its edges were sharp and defined, and it gave off an almost blinding luminescence. I froze, unable to look away, my heart thundering in my chest. It was completely still at first, like a statue carved from light itself. But as I watched, I noticed a faint movement, like it was breathing or vibrating with some unseen energy. Then, slowly, it turned its head toward the couch where my mother and her husband were sleeping. It didn't make a sound, didn't move any closer, but the air in the room seemed to grow heavier, thicker, as though the figure's presence was warping it somehow. I squeezed my eyes shut, tears streaming down my face as I prayed for it to go away. When I finally dared to look again, it was gone. The living room was dark, the air still once more, but I couldn't shake the image of it from my mind. I told my mother about it the next morning, though I tried to downplay the terror I felt. To my surprise, she didn't dismiss it outright. Instead, she grew quiet, her face pale, and then she told me about her own experiences. She said she'd been waking up in the middle of the night, unable to move, feeling as though something heavy was pressing down on her chest. She described the sensation of a figure leaning over her, its presence dark and suffocating. She said it wore a hood, its features obscured by shadow, and she could feel it pulling something out of her, like it was draining her energy. She had tried to scream, but no sound would come out. She called it Hoodie, a name that felt absurdly casual for something so horrifying. Her confession made everything worse. Knowing I wasn't alone in experiencing these things didn't bring me any comfort, it only deepened my fear. If it was happening to her too, then it wasn't just in my head. And it wasn't going to stop. Over the next few weeks, the activity in the house escalated. The lights became more erratic, flashing and flickering at random hours, sometimes bright enough to wake the twins in their cribs. Their cries would echo through the house, piercing the already tense atmosphere, and I would hear my mother rushing to soothe them. The scratching at the windows grew louder, more insistent, and I began to notice faint streaks on the glass in the mornings, as though something had been clawing at it during the night. My bed started shaking more frequently too. It was subtle at first, just a faint vibration that I could almost convince myself was my imagination. But it didn't stay subtle for long. One night, I woke to find the entire bed frame rattling violently, the metal legs scraping against the floorboards. I clung to the mattress, too terrified to move, and when it finally stopped, I could still feel the phantom tremors buzzing through my body. And then there was the sleep paralysis. The first time it happened, I thought I was dying. I woke up in the middle of the night, completely unable to move. My body felt like it was encased in cement, my chest heaving as I struggled to breathe. I could see everything in my room, the dim outlines of the chifforobe, the faint glow of moonlight through the curtains, but I couldn't turn my head or lift my arms. And then I felt it. The presence. It was there, looming over me, its weight pressing down on my chest. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it, cold, suffocating, and utterly malevolent. My ears filled with a low, droning hum, like the sound of distant machinery, and for a moment, I thought I could hear faint whispers threading through the noise. When it finally released me, I gasped for air, tears streaming down my face as I lay trembling in bed. The experience left me shaken to my core, and I couldn't bring myself to sleep for the rest of the night. I told my mother about it the next morning, and that's when she told me about her own sleep paralysis episodes. Her descriptions mirrored mine almost exactly, the weight on her chest, the droning sound, the whispers. The only difference was the hooded figure she saw, the one she said was stealing her energy. The thought of something actively feeding off her made my skin crawl. We started to notice changes in her after that. She grew pale and tired, her eyes sunken and dark. She blamed it on stress and lack of sleep, but I knew better. Whatever was in the house was wearing her down, and I was terrified it wouldn't stop until there was nothing left of her. The thought of losing her to this unseen force filled me with a cold, gnawing dread, and I couldn't help but wonder how long it would be before it turned its attention to me, or my siblings. The house was alive, and it was hungry. As the years passed, the house's hold on us only tightened. What began as shadows, whispers, and strange lights evolved into something darker, more calculated. By the time I was a teenager, I had grown used to the peculiarities of the house, or at least I thought I had. But when I moved into a different room, everything changed, and the house's true nature revealed itself in ways that defied my ability to rationalize. The new room was smaller than my old one, but somehow felt even more oppressive. It had a single window that overlooked the backyard, where the trees stood like silent sentinels, their twisted branches casting skeletal shadows against the walls. My bed was pushed into the corner, directly across from a narrow closet with a warped door that never quite closed all the way. The air in the room was stagnant, thick with the smell of damp wood and something faintly metallic, and no matter how many times we scrubbed the walls or aired it out, the odor persisted. The activity in the house seemed to focus on me almost immediately after I moved into that room. It started with the closet door. At night, I would close it tightly, wedging a chair under the handle to keep it shut, but every morning, without fail, it would be slightly ajar, the chair moved just enough to suggest deliberate intent. Sometimes, I would hear the faint creak of the door in the dead of night, followed by a soft rustling sound that seemed to come from deep within the closet itself. It felt as though something was living in there, waiting for the perfect moment to make itself known. My sleep became increasingly restless, plagued by vivid nightmares that left me drenched in sweat. In my dreams, the house was alive, its walls pulsing like the inside of a living creature, the floorboards twisting and writhing beneath my feet. I would hear voices calling my name, their tone mocking and cruel, and when I turned to look, I would see shadowy figures lurking in the corners, their faces obscured by darkness. But the worst part of these dreams was the sense of being watched, an unrelenting gaze that followed me wherever I went, even when I woke. One night, I woke to the sound of something scratching at the walls this time. It was faint at first, like the gentle scrape of nails against wood, but it quickly grew louder, more frantic, as though something trapped inside the walls was trying to claw its way out. I sat frozen in bed, clutching the blanket to my chest, my heart pounding as the sound moved closer and closer. And then it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing down on me like a physical weight. But before I could catch my breath, the closet door creaked open, just wide enough for the darkness inside to spill out like a living thing. I didn't dare move, my eyes locked on the gap in the door, half expecting something to step out and drag me into the abyss. The next morning, I found deep gouges in the wood paneling near the closet, as though some massive clawed hand had raked against it. My mother dismissed it as the result of an old house settling, but I could see the fear in her eyes. She knew, just as I did, that the house was beyond saving. As time went on, the entity in the house began to grow bolder. It wasn't just confined to my room anymore, it spread its influence throughout the entire house. My siblings, now toddlers, began waking in the middle of the night, screaming uncontrollably. My mother tried to console them, but they refused to explain what had frightened them, their wide, tear-filled eyes darting toward shadows that only they could see. Even her husband, who had always been skeptical of the supernatural, began to experience things he couldn't explain, cold spots that followed him from room to room, the sensation of being touched by invisible hands, objects moving on their own. His demeanor changed over time, growing more irritable and paranoid, until he finally packed his things and left, refusing to step foot in the house ever again. My mother tried to keep the family together, but the house was wearing her down. She became more withdrawn, her health deteriorating rapidly. The dark circles under her eyes deepened, and her once lively spirit was replaced by a hollow, haunted look. I would often catch her staring at nothing, her lips moving silently as though she were speaking to someone I couldn't see. When I asked her about it, she would dismiss my concerns, but I knew she was trying to protect me from the truth. The turning point came one night when I woke to the sound of my siblings crying. Their screams were unlike anything I'd ever heard before, high-pitched and guttural, filled with pure terror. I rushed to their room, only to find them huddled in the corner of their cribs, pointing toward the ceiling. When I looked up, I saw it, the figure my mother had described so many years ago. Hootie. It hung there, suspended in the air like a dark smudge against reality itself. Its hood obscured its face, but I could feel its gaze boring into me, cold and malevolent. The room seemed to darken around it, the shadows stretching and twisting like living things. I grabbed my siblings and ran, my heart racing as I carried them to my mother's room. I found her sitting on the edge of the bed, staring blankly at the floor. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and she barely reacted when I shook her, begging her to leave the house with me. It was as though the house had drained the life out of her, leaving behind only an empty shell. That night, I made the decision to leave. I packed what little I could carry, bundled up my siblings, and walked out the front door without looking back. The air outside was cold and sharp, a stark contrast to the suffocating heaviness of the house. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. We never returned to the house after that. My mother moved in with relatives, and though she never fully recovered from her time in that place, she seemed to improve slightly with distance. As for me, I tried to put it all behind me, but the memories stayed with me, clawing at the edges of my mind like the entity that had haunted us for so long. Years later, I heard that the house had been abandoned, its windows boarded up, its walls left to crumble. No one wanted to live there, not even the most desperate. Sometimes I wonder if the house is still waiting, its darkness lying dormant until the next family moves in, unaware of the horrors that await them. I hope no one ever does. Some places aren't meant to be lived in. Some houses should be left to rot, taking their secrets with them into the earth. But deep down, I know the house will never truly die. It's alive in a way that defies explanation, and it will keep feeding, waiting, and watching until someone is foolish enough to open its doors once more.